The morning I signed the divorce papers, I didn't cry. I remember sitting at the kitchen table in that oversized gray sweater I'd owned since college, both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier, watching my husband read through the settlement agreement with the kind of relief people usually wear when a doctor tells them that surgery was successful, like he'd been carrying something heavy for years, and someone had finally taken it away. He reached the last page, looked up, and frowned. "You're really not asking for anything." "I'm asking for one thing." He looked back at the papers. "My mother." "Yes." He blinked. "You want my mother?" "I want her to live with me." For a second he simply stared, then he laughed. Not cruelly, not mockingly. It was the laugh of a man who had just discovered the disaster he'd feared wasn't going to cost him after all. Done. He grabbed the pen. God, yes. Done. He signed his name almost before the ink from the previous page had dried. 3 days later he handed me a cashier's check for $8,000. To help with the transition, he said. I thanked him. I never told him I considered it guilt wearing a business suit. The truth was, I needed every dollar. I had less than $500 in my checking account, a tiny apartment waiting for me, and a 71-year-old woman who needed somewhere safe to live. Neither of us understood what had really happened that morning. He believed he had escaped with everything he wanted. I had unknowingly walked away with the most valuable thing our marriage had ever given me. My name is Claire Morrison. I'm 33 years old. And if you've ever discovered that family isn't always the people you marry, sometimes it's the people who quietly choose you, then stay with me. Because this story isn't really about my divorce. It's about the woman my husband never realized he was giving away. I met Daniel when I was 24. He was 32. Back then, 8 years sounded sophisticated. Now I know it mostly meant he'd had 8 extra years of getting his own way. He was charming, funny, confident, the kind of confident that comes naturally to people who rarely hear the word no. When he smiled, entire rooms relaxed. When he talked, everyone listened. Looking back, I think I fell in love with certainty. He always seemed certain. Certain about restaurants, certain about careers, certain about vacations, certain about where we'd live, certain about what color to paint the kitchen. At 24, certainty looked a lot like security. So after 2 years together, I married him. I left my apartment, left my neighborhood, left my favorite bookstore, left my friends who all lived downtown, and moved 40 minutes away into the suburban house he'd bought before we ever met. At the time, I called it compromise. Years later, I realized I had been the only one compromising. The neighborhood was beautiful, tree-lined streets, perfect lawns, families who all seemed to know each other. I didn't. I spent months trying to become the wife I imagined everyone expected. I learned recipes I didn't enjoy cooking, hosted dinners I didn't enjoy attending, smiled through conversations that exhausted me. Somewhere along the way, I quietly disappeared. No one noticed, except one person, my mother-in-law. Margaret. She first came to visit during our very first Thanksgiving as a married couple. She arrived, carrying 2 things, a homemade pecan pie and an old rolling suitcase that leaned dramatically to the left, because one wheel barely worked anymore. I offered to buy her a new one. She smiled. This one still gets where it's going. Then she added something that would stay with me forever. I don't replace loyal things. She said it so casually, as though she were commenting on the weather, but something about those words settled inside me. After dinner she accepted a cup of coffee, looked around the kitchen for a moment, then quietly asked, "So, how are you really? Not how's married life, not are you happy, how are you, really?" No one had asked me that since the wedding. I started answering automatically, "Oh, everything's great." She smiled. "No, I asked how you are." There was no judgment, no pressure, just genuine curiosity. I surprised myself. "I think I'm trying very hard." She nodded immediately. "I thought so." That was all. No lecture, no advice, just understanding. Later that evening, while Daniel watched football in the living room, she helped me wash dishes. She dried each plate carefully before placing it in the cabinet. Without looking at me, she said, "My son gets restless." I stopped drying a glass. "I'm sure you've noticed." I simply hadn't admitted it. "He's not a bad man," she continued. "He's just never learned that other people's lives matter as much as his own." I looked at her. She shrugged. "I raised him." I know his strengths. I also know his blind spots. I didn't know what to say. She smiled softly. Just don't lose yourself trying to keep him comfortable. It was the first warning anyone had ever given me. I didn't understand it then. I wish I had. Margaret visited 4 or 5 times every year after that. Always with pie. Always with the same broken suitcase. Always remembering things no one else remembered. She remembered the author I mentioned wanting to read. She remembered how I took my tea whenever I was stressed. She remembered birthdays, doctor appointments, conversations we'd had 6 months earlier. Daniel barely noticed. He loved his mother, but he rarely listened. He assumed she'd always be there. I never made that mistake. Over the years, she slowly became one of my favorite people. Sometimes we'd talk for hours after Daniel went to bed. About books, gardens, travel, marriage, regret, growing older. She never pretended life was simple. She simply believed difficult things could be survived. I didn't realize how much I depended on those conversations, until they became the brightest part of my marriage. Around our 6th anniversary, something changed. Not dramatically, quietly. Daniel stopped telling complete stories. He started working later. His phone was suddenly always face down. Business trips appeared with little notice. Conversations became summaries. People don't shorten their stories by accident. They shorten them when they're protecting parts of their lives they don't want you to see. I ignored it for months. Not because I believed him. Because I wasn't ready to believe myself. Then one rainy Thursday afternoon, everything ended. I'd driven to his office because he'd left his jacket in my car. I almost mailed it instead. I almost turned around halfway there. Instead, I parked. And before I opened my door, I saw him. Standing in the parking garage. A young woman laughing. His hand resting comfortably against the small of her back. They kissed. Not quickly. Not guiltily. Like two people who had forgotten the rest of the world existed. I never got out of my car. I sat there for 20 minutes. Then I drove home. Made dinner. Asked him how work had been. And said absolutely nothing. Not because I was weak. Because I needed time. For the next 8 weeks, I quietly rebuilt myself. I opened a savings account only I could access. Copied important financial documents. Met with an attorney. Told only my older sister. And during those same weeks, I found myself calling Margaret more often than ever before. Long conversations. Sometimes an hour. Sometimes 2. One evening she interrupted me. Something's wrong. It wasn't a question. A lot of things. Are you safe? Yes. She nodded. Then you'll figure it out. That was all she said. No interrogation. No drama. Just complete confidence that I was stronger than whatever I hadn't yet told her. When I finally confronted Daniel, everything happened exactly the way I'd imagined. He denied it. Then admitted it. Then called it complicated. It wasn't. Finally, he looked at the floor and quietly said, "Her name is Justine. She's pregnant." Silence filled the room. I think. I want to marry her. I looked at him for a very long time. Then I simply said, "Okay, I want a divorce." The relief on his face answered every question I still had. 2 months later, we sat across from each other in our lawyer's office. My attorney had carefully explained that I could ask for far more than I intended to. Part of the house. Retirement accounts. Spousal support. Investments. Instead, when the settlement papers were placed in front of me, I asked for one thing, his mother, and without realizing it, my husband agreed to the worst bargain of his entire life. The first thing Margaret said after I told her about the divorce wasn't, "What did my son do?" It wasn't, "Are you sure?" And it certainly wasn't, "Can this be fixed?" She looked at me across her small kitchen table in North Carolina, folded her hands together, and quietly asked, "Are you sleeping?" I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was exactly the question someone asks when they're trying to understand whether you're surviving, instead of merely existing. Not much. She nodded. I figured. That was Margaret. She never chased the headline. She paid attention to the damage underneath it. I hadn't planned on telling her everything that afternoon. I'd driven 10 hours with my sister under the excuse of coming to visit. But halfway through lunch, I realized I couldn't keep pretending. "I saw him," I said. She looked up. With someone else. The room became perfectly still. She didn't interrupt. Didn't gasp. Didn't defend him. Didn't rush to explain. She simply waited. "Her name is Justine." Another long silence. She's pregnant. Margaret closed her eyes for just a second. Not dramatically. Almost like someone hearing news they'd hoped would never arrive. When, several months, so. She inhaled slowly. He lied to you every day. I nodded. She stood up without saying another word. Walked to the kettle. Filled it with water, set it on the stove. Only after the burner clicked on did she finally speak again. I'm sorry. Not. I'm sorry this happened. Not. I'm sorry my son made a mistake. Just, I'm sorry. There is something powerful about an apology that doesn't protect the guilty. That afternoon, she never defended him once. Not once. The divorce moved surprisingly quickly. Daniel wanted freedom. I wanted peace. Our attorneys exchanged drafts for several weeks. Before scheduling one final meeting, the night before we signed everything, Margaret called me. Are you afraid? A little. Good. I blinked. Good. The people who aren't afraid before changing, their lives usually haven't understood how important the change is. I smiled despite myself. I'll be okay. I know. She paused. Calm. I just wish it hadn't cost you so much to find out. The conference room felt strangely ordinary. Gray carpet. Cheap coffee. Artificial plants in the corners. Amazing. How places where lives permanently change can look so completely forgettable. Daniel arrived 10 minutes early. His lawyer organized paperwork. Mine reviewed the final documents with me, one last time. Everything was straightforward. The house stayed with him. His retirement accounts stayed with him. His investments stayed with him. I kept my car, my personal savings, and one final condition. His attorney cleared his throat. My client has one question. Daniel looked across the table. Why my mother? I answered honestly. Because she's family. He actually laughed. You know she's difficult. No. I know she's honest. There's a difference. His attorney slid over the amended agreement. 3 years of financial support for Margaret's living expenses, healthcare, insurance, medication, transportation. Daniel studied the numbers, then shrugged. This is cheaper than assisted living. My attorney looked at me. I kept my face perfectly still. Daniel picked up the pen, signed, closed the folder. And just like that, 7 years of marriage officially ended. 3 days later he handed me the cashier's check, $8,000. I hope this helps. It will. He shifted awkwardly. I never wanted to hurt you. I looked at him. No. You just didn't mind if you did. For the first time. He had no answer. 2 weeks later, my sister and I drove to North Carolina. Margaret had already packed. There weren't many boxes. Mostly books. Family photographs. Kitchensupplies.com. Her favorite chair. And, of course, the broken suitcase. You really are bringing that thing. My sister laughed. Margaret smiled. It survived longer than 2 marriages. We all laughed. Even me. Before leaving, Margaret walked slowly through every room of the house she'd shared with her husband for 30 years. She touched the dining room doorway. Ran her fingers across the fireplace mantel. Stopped in the garden. I planted those roses the year Daniel started kindergarten. She said softly, you don't have to leave today. She looked at me. Oh, sweetheart. I left this house a long time ago. I've just been waiting for someone to invite me somewhere new. The drive back took almost 10 hours. We stopped often because her knees hurt. At every gas station, she insisted on paying for coffee. At every rest stop she apologized for walking slowly. By sunset, we crossed into our new town. When we finally reached my apartment, she stood quietly in the living room. It's smaller than my house. It is. It's warmer. She smiled. It already feels more like home. That night she unpacked exactly one box. The kitchen box. Within 20 minutes, she'd arranged the mugs. Found places for the plates. Hung her apron behind the pantry door. The next morning I woke to the smell of coffee. Then bacon. Then cinnamon. I walked into the kitchen. Margaret was humming softly while flipping pancakes. I thought you were supposed to be the one taking care of me. I laughed. She glanced over her shoulder. Don't be ridiculous. I'm retired, not dead. For the first time in years, breakfast felt peaceful. Not performed. Not polite. Just peaceful. As I watched her place pancakes onto 2 warm plates, I had no idea that within a few months, this 71-year-old woman, everyone thought needed rescuing, was about to completely change the direction of my life. The first month, after Margaret moved in, settled into a rhythm, so naturally that sometimes I forgot we'd ever lived any other way. Tuesday mornings belonged to grocery shopping. Thursday afternoons meant the public library. Saturday was always the farmer's market. She insisted tomatoes should never be bought from supermarkets if there was another option. I survived raising a teenage boy, she told one farmer. I'm certainly not settling for tasteless tomatoes. He laughed so hard he gave us 2 extra peaches. She made friends the way some people collect postcards. Quietly. Without trying. Within 6 weeks she knew the librarian by name. The pharmacist saved crossword books for her. The woman at the bakery automatically wrapped 2 cinnamon rolls every Friday morning because she knew. Margaret would insist on sharing one with me over coffee. Meanwhile, I was trying to rebuild my own life. For years I'd quietly worked on a small online business after Daniel went to bed. Nothing glamorous. Handmade home organization products.com. Digital planners, simple storage solutions. I'd designed after years of organizing everyone else's lives. I'd never had enough money to grow it. Every dollar had gone toward our household. Toward Daniel's ambitions, toward the future we were supposedly building together. Now, for the first time, the future belonged to me. I spent mornings answering customer emails, afternoons designing new products.com, evenings packing orders from a folding table, squeezed into the corner of our apartment. Margaret watched all of it with quiet interest. One evening she asked, "How many orders today?" 30. She nodded thoughtfully. "And last month?" "About 12 a day. So you're growing, I guess." She looked at me over her reading glasses. "No, I don't think you guess. I think you've forgotten you're allowed to be proud." That sentence stayed with me for days. Around that same time, news from Daniel started arriving without me asking for it. Mostly through my sister. Apparently, life with Justine wasn't unfolding the way either of them had imagined. She wanted renovations to the house, a larger engagement ring, a different car before the baby arrived. Daniel hated conflict, always had. He'd spent years avoiding difficult conversations. Now, conflict lived in his kitchen. Every morning, every evening, every decision. One Saturday, my sister called while I was labeling shipping boxes. "You'll never believe this." "What happened?" "Justine moved out." I stopped taping a package. "What?" "They've been fighting constantly. She went to stay with her parents." I waited. "Do you feel sorry for him?" my sister asked. I thought about it. Longer than she probably expected. I searched for the right word. Distant. She laughed softly. "That's healthier." Margaret never celebrated any of Daniel's problems. Not once. When I mentioned the separation, she quietly buttered another piece of toast. I hoped he'd learn before life taught him. "Looks like life." There wasn't anger in her voice. Only sadness. A mother never completely stops hoping. Even after disappointment becomes familiar. About 3 months after she moved in, she knocked on my bedroom door one evening. "Do you have a minute?" She carried a worn leather folder. The kind people used before everything became digital. We sat at the kitchen table. She slid the folder toward me. "I want you to look at something." Inside were investment statements, savings accounts, certificates of deposit, property documents. I stared, then looked back at her. "I don't understand." She smiled. "I think you do." I slowly turned another page. The numbers kept getting bigger. Far bigger. "I've been careful." She folded her hands. "Your father-in-law and I saved almost everything." I looked at her in complete disbelief. "Daniel doesn't know. He knows I was comfortable. He doesn't know how comfortable." "Why not?" "Because he never asked." That answer somehow made perfect sense. She reached across the table, placed one hand gently over mine. "I've been thinking." Immediately I shook my head. "Margaret." She smiled. "Please let me finish. You walked away from a marriage with almost nothing. You brought me into your home. You've never once made me feel like a burden." She looked directly into my eyes. "I'd like to invest in your business." I couldn't speak. She continued. "Not give. Invest. I've watched you work. I've watched you answer emails at midnight. I've watched you wake up before sunrise to package orders. I've watched you build something from absolutely nothing." She smiled. "I've invested in worse ideas." I laughed through sudden tears. "No, I can't." "You can." "No, I really can't." She reached over, closed the folder, then asked one simple question. "If your own mother offered to help, would you say no?" I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Because she already knew the answer. I didn't accept immediately. Instead, I met with my accountant, a financial advisor, my attorney, even my sister. Every single one of them said exactly the same thing. If the investment is documented properly, and both of you understand the terms, there is nothing wrong with accepting it. 2 weeks later, Margaret and I sat together in the attorney's office. Everything was formal: contracts, ownership percentages, repayment structure. She refused to make it a gift. I believe in businesses, she smiled. And I believe in you. She transferred enough money to completely transform my company. Not millions, not even close, but enough. Enough to hire employees, enough to lease warehouse space, enough to finally stop wondering whether next month's rent would clear. When the paperwork was finished, I looked at her. Why? She smiled exactly the way she had the first Thanksgiving we'd met. Because you're loyal, and I don't replace loyal things. That was the moment I finally cried. Not because of the money, because for the first time in years, someone had invested in me instead of expecting me to invest everything into someone else. I didn't realize it then. But within 18 months, that investment would grow into something neither of us had ever imagined. The first year after Margaret invested in my business passed so quickly that sometimes I measured it by shipping labels instead of seasons. At first, I hired 1 employee, then 2, then 5. The folding table in my apartment disappeared. The spare bedroom stopped being a warehouse. Boxers no longer lined our hallway. By the end of the first year, we had moved into a small commercial space with white walls, polished concrete floors, and a loading dock that seemed impossibly large the first day I unlocked it. "It smells like possibility," Margaret said, standing beside me. "It smells like fresh paint." She laughed. They're usually the same thing. Every Friday afternoon, she brought lunch to the office: homemade soup in a slow cooker, fresh bread wrapped in towels, cookies for whoever happened to be working late. My employees started calling her Miss Margaret. She learned every one of their birthdays, remembered their children's names, asked about sick parents and college exams, without ever holding an official title. She somehow became everyone's favorite part of the company. One afternoon I overheard our newest employee whisper to another, "I wish my grandmother was like her." Margaret pretended not to hear. Later that evening she quietly admitted, "I've never had coworkers before. You owned a business. I had customers. This is different." She smiled into her tea. "I like belonging somewhere." Business continued growing faster than I had ever expected. Retail stores started carrying our products. A national home organization magazine featured one of our storage systems. Orders tripled almost overnight. The warehouse became too small. Then the office became too small. Problems I had once dreamed about became real. One evening I looked at Margaret across the dinner table. "I think we're going to need another building." She grinned. "I was wondering how long it would take you to notice." Daniel called for the first time almost 18 months after the divorce. His name appeared on my phone while I was reviewing payroll. I stared at it, then answered, "Hello." His voice sounded older, not physically, emotionally. "I hope I'm not interrupting. You are." He laughed quietly. "You always were honest. What do you need?" There was a long silence. I wanted to apologize. I waited. For everything. Not for the affair. Not for lying. For everything. I wasn't a very good husband. No, I wasn't. Another silence. I didn't understand what I had. I looked out the warehouse window, where 2 employees were loading trucks. "I believe you." "You do." "I do." His voice softened. "Thank you." Then, very quietly, "How's Mom?" I smiled despite myself. "She's arguing with my warehouse manager because she thinks the coffee machine is in the wrong place." He laughed. A real laugh. I can picture that. "She's happy. I'm glad. So am I." We ended the call 5 minutes later. Neither of us mentioned getting back together. Neither of us wanted to. Some relationships end because people stop loving each other. Ours ended because one of us stopped respecting the life we had built. Love alone was never enough to repair that. A few months later my sister sent me an article. Daniel's former company had become the subject of a financial investigation. Irregular accounting, misallocated funds, internal complaints. Nothing criminal. At least not yet. But serious enough that several executives resigned. Daniel's name wasn't the headline. It appeared 3 paragraphs down. I read the article once, closed it, went back to work. That evening, Margaret noticed I seemed distracted. News, a little bad. For someone. She studied my face. Do you need to talk about it? No. She nodded. Then don't. That was another thing I loved about her. She never insisted every feeling had to become a conversation. Sometimes peace came from letting a story stay exactly where it belonged. In the past, about 4 months later, my sister called again. Justine left. What? She took the baby and moved back with her parents. I closed my laptop. Are they divorcing? They were never married. I didn't answer. He lost almost everything, she continued. The business. The relationship. The house is for sale. I looked toward the living room. Margaret was asleep in her favorite chair with a crossword puzzle open on her lap. The broken suitcase still sat in her bedroom closet. She refused to throw it away. Not because she needed it, because, as she liked to remind me, loyal things deserve loyalty. Later that evening she asked, "Is my son in trouble?" I nodded. The kind he created himself. She sighed. I was afraid of that. You knew? I knew he kept choosing shortcuts. She looked down at her crossword. Shortcuts eventually become cliffs. That sentence stayed with me. Life kept moving. Another warehouse.com. More employees. More customers. Our annual revenue passed $1 million. The day my accountant told me, I drove home in complete silence. Margaret was making peach cobbler. Everything okay? I nodded. Then burst into tears. She immediately turned off the oven. What happened? We crossed 7 figures. She blinked once. Then smiled. I knew you would. You did. I invested in you, not luck. She hugged me tightly. I'm proud of your work. Not your success. Your work. There was an important difference. Success can disappear. Character usually doesn't. As we stood together in that tiny kitchen, holding each other while peach cobbler cooled on the counter, neither of us realized that within the next year, the one person neither of us expected would knock on our front door would be Daniel himself. Almost 3 years had passed since the morning Daniel signed away his marriage, and, without realizing it, the best relationship in his life. By then, our apartment was gone. Not because we couldn't afford it, because we had outgrown it. Margaret still insisted she would have been perfectly happy staying there forever. I've lived in smaller, I know. And I've lived in bigger, I know. But I've never lived somewhere that felt this peaceful. Still, peace didn't mean we couldn't have a little more space. So we bought a small white house on a quiet street with a wide front porch, and a maple tree in the front yard. Nothing extravagant. Just enough room for both of us. She claimed the sunny bedroom overlooking the garden before I'd even finished unpacking. I've earned the room with the better light. You absolutely have. The broken suitcase sat in the corner beside her closet, still leaning slightly to the left, still refusing to retire. Our business continued growing, not explosively anymore. Steadily, healthily, the kind of growth that lets people sleep at night. We employed 23 people, had customers in every state, and every Friday, Margaret still brought homemade cookies to the office. Nobody expected her to. Everybody looked forward to it. One afternoon, I walked into the break room and found 2 employees asking her for marriage advice. She looked completely serious. The secret. They nodded eagerly. Marry someone who notices when you're tired. Silence. Then she added, if they don't notice the small things, they'll never survive the big ones. The room became very quiet. I smiled from the hallway. She had spent her whole life saying profound things as though they were ordinary observations. Late one Tuesday afternoon, the receptionist called my office. Claire, yes, there's someone here asking for you. I'm busy. He says he's your ex. I froze. I'll come down. Daniel looked different. Not dramatically, just lighter in some places, heavier in others. His expensive suits were gone. His confidence had softened. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked like a man who had spent several years listening instead of talking. I won't keep you long, he said. What do you need? He held out a small envelope. I found this while cleaning. Inside was an old photograph. Thanksgiving, our first year of marriage. Margaret sat between us laughing at something outside the frame. I hadn't seen the picture in years. I thought you should have it. Thank you. He hesitated. Can I ask one question? I nodded. Is she happy? I smiled before answering. Very. He looked relieved. And, does she ever? He stopped. Does she ask about me? I chose honesty. Sometimes. What does she say? Usually, I looked at him. She asks whether you're eating properly. He laughed. Calm. Then wiped one eye. That sounds like Mom. It does. Another long silence settled between us. Finally he asked, would she? He struggled with the sentence. Would she want to see me? I thought carefully. I don't know. But I think you should ask her yourself. That evening, I told Margaret about the visit. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she kept trimming green beans for dinner. Finally she sighed. He's still my son. I know. I've never stopped loving him. I know. That doesn't mean I liked what he became. I reached across the table. You don't have to see him. She looked at me. No, I think I do. The following Saturday, Daniel came over. He stood on the porch, looking more nervous than I'd ever seen him. Margaret opened the door herself. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then she stepped forward, wrapped both arms around him, and hugged him. Not because he'd earned it, because she was his mother. When she finally stepped back, the first thing she said wasn't, I missed you. It wasn't, I forgive you. She looked directly into his eyes. Have you finally gotten tired? He blinked. Tired? Of running away from yourself? His shoulders dropped. Yes. Very quietly. Yes. She nodded. I wondered how long it would take. They sat on the porch for nearly 3 hours. I stayed inside. Some conversations belong only to the people living them. Later, Daniel knocked softly on the kitchen door before leaving. I owe you something. You don't. I do. He looked around the house, the garden, the laughter, my mother's smile. He swallowed. I thought you were taking something from me. You actually saved the person I loved most. I didn't answer, because there wasn't anything left to say. He walked down the driveway, stopped beside his car, turned back one last time. I was the luckiest man in the world. His voice cracked, and I didn't know it. Then he drove away. I watched until his car disappeared around the corner. Margaret quietly joined me at the window. He'll be okay. You think so? I do. What changed? She smiled. Regret. When it's honest, it finally teaches. As we stood there together, I realized something remarkable. For years, I'd thought divorce had taken my family away. Standing beside the woman who had chosen me long after the marriage ended, I finally understood the opposite was true. I hadn't lost my family. I'd simply discovered who it really was.